Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. Currently on Blessed Man Meditations, we're going through Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster? In which we make sense of the Old Testament God. These are the contents of that book. I'll give you a moment if you want to pause it so you can look at them. Here's Paul Copan. Got his PhD from Marquette University and works at Palm Beach Atlantic University in Florida as the Pledger Family Chair of Philosophy and Ethics. So he is an expert on the topics that are discussed in this book. He's written edited over 20 apologetics and philosophy books, lives in Florida. Chapter 9 of Is God a Moral Monster? It talks about barbarisms, crude laws, and other imaginary crimes. And it looks at punishments and other harsh realities that appear in the biblical text and puts them in perspective. Copan begins chapter 9 by saying, in many ways, life in the ancient Near East was much like the state of nature described by philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who lived in the 16th and 17th centuries, in his Leviathan. The state of nature, as quoted by Hobbes in Leviathan, was characterized as nasty, brutish, and short. The state of nature was no picnic, to be sure, and many of the ancient Near Eastern laws reflected this harsh, morally underdeveloped existence. Copan, to this point, has taken pains to show that the Old Testament laws were not given in a vacuum. Though the Old Testament laws presented a dramatic moral improvement, the Old Testament laws also reflected the ancient Near Eastern social context. So, when the new atheists of the 21st century refer to barbarisms, crude laws, and other imaginary crimes found in the Old Testament scripture, they no doubt have these kinds of passages in their minds. The first of these type passages comes from the book of Leviticus, chapter 20. It says, for everyone who curses his father and mother shall surely be put to death. He has cursed his father or mother, his blood shall be upon him. So being killed for cursing father or mother. Leviticus chapter 24, verses 10 to 14. Now the son of an Israelite woman whose father was an Egyptian went out among the children of Israel, and this Israelite woman's son and a man of Israel fought each other in the camp. And the Israelite woman's son blasphemed the name of the Lord and cursed. So they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shelemith, the daughter of Dibri, of the tribe of Dan. Then they put him in custody, that the mind of the Lord might be shown to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take outside the camp him who has cursed. Then let all who heard him lay their hands on his head, and let all the congregation stone him. Again, Numbers chapter 15, verses 32 to 36. Now, while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron, and to all the congregation. They put him under guard, because it had not been explained what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, the man must surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. So as the Lord commanded Moses, all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him with stones, and he died. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 18 to 21. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son, who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and who, when they have chastened him, will not heed them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of the city, to the gate of his city. And they shall say to the elders of a city, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of this city shall stone him to death with stones, so you shall put away the evil from among you, and all Israel shall hear and fear. Well, from passages like those, it sure looks like the law of Moses is severe with all this death penalty and harsh punishment talk. Some Westerners utterly disapprove of even modest corporal punishment. In fact, it is illegal in places like Sweden and other Nordic countries to use corporal punishment. So, when we come to the Old Testament laws, the punishments that we just read seem outrageous. Critics claim that stoning people is primitive and barbaric, and that the death penalty itself is cruel and unusual punishment. Now, Copan is not advocating stoning people as punishment. Copan is not advocating a death penalty for those who reject the Bible. Copan will try to put some of this harsh-sounding legislation into perspective. First, in chapter 9 of Is God a Moral Monster, we are going to see how ancient Near Eastern law codes and the Mosaic law play into this. Copan has repeated the theme that the Mosaic law was given to Israel in a morally inferior ancient Near Eastern context. Other ancient Near Eastern law codes existed in the 2nd millennium BC and were known as cuneiform law. Cuneiform refers to the wedge-shaped characters or letters inscribed on ancient Near Eastern clay tablets, typically with a reed stylus. Included in this list are the laws of Ur-Nammu, about 1925 BC, who ruled the Sumerian city of Isin. The Akkadian laws of Eshuna, about 1800 BC, a city 100 miles north of Babylon. The Babylonian laws of Hammurabi, 1750 BC, and the Hittite laws of Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey. We shouldn't be surprised that there are parallels and overlap between various ancient Near Eastern laws and the Mosaic law. In fact, various sayings and maxims in the biblical book of Proverbs sound a lot like adaptations or borrowings from the Egyptian work Instruction of Amenemope. I wouldn't be surprised if I'm mispronouncing Amenemope. Biblical writers might quote a work of poetry like the book of Jasher, which is quoted in Joshua chapter 10 verse 13 and 2 Samuel chapter 1 verse 18, or they might consult official documents as the writer of the book of Chronicles does, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Along these lines, we could view Moses as something of an editor of the Pentateuch, who appropriates oral traditions and writings related to the creation in Israel's patriarchal history. Later, in the New Testament, the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, the first 4 verses, reveals an orderly research project investigating the Jesus traditions that had accumulated in order to compile a trustworthy biography of Jesus. These human endeavors, writing styles, literary genres, and personalities are part of the Spirit-inspired inscripturation process. Some have compared the making of the Scriptures to the doctrine of the Incarnation. In the person of Jesus of Nazareth, the divine and human are brought together. Likewise, simply because a writer's personality or style or various processes are involved, or because outside material was borrowed, doesn't mean that God's inspiring spirit wasn't involved in the scripture formation. Again, various parallels and similarities exist between ancient Near Eastern laws and the Mosaic law, and more specifically the Covenant Code of Exodus in chapters 20 through 23. Whether this can be capital punishment for murder or legislation regarding goring an ox. And yes, there were certain humanizing improvements in various ancient Near Eastern codes over time. For example, a softening of legislation from the old Hittite laws from around 1650 to 1500 BC to the new Hittite laws from 1500 to 1180 BC. But at key points, whopping differences exist between the Mosaic law and other Near Eastern codes. The Sinai legislation presents genuinely remarkable, previously unheard of, legal and moral advances. Not surprisingly, critics like the New Atheists focus on the negative while overlooking dramatic improvements. Why bother with nuance when you can score rhetorical points about the backward ways of the ancient Near East? Right. Why dig deep and get to the bottom of what is really going on in some of these Old Testament texts, when you can just read it at surface value, face value, and because you have a preconceived bias in your mind against a theistic universe and a God who rules it, you can just score your rhetorical points based on a society that was very that was morally very deficient. Throughout the rest of Part 2, Copan will highlight these significant differences. As we delve more deeply with Copan into this study, we will continue to affirm two things. First, that certain Old Testament laws and punishments were inferior to creational ideals, found in the first two chapters of Genesis. And the second thing that we will continue to affirm is that the Mosaic law is not permanent, universal, and the standard for all nations. So, we should evaluate the severity of harsh laws and punishments in their ancient Near Eastern context, instead of in light of the Western culture in which we live. Indeed, to the minds of the ancient Near Eastern peoples, we Westerners would be considered a bunch of softies. So now let's look at Sabbath-Breakers and Slanderers. The Sabbath-breaker story in Numbers chapter 15, verses 32 to 36, comes on the heels of legislation regarding unintentional sins and defiant or high-handed sins. The stick-gathering Sabbath-breaker illustrates a defiant act. It's a direct violation of God's clear commands in Exodus chapters 31 and 35. The one working on the Sabbath was to be put to death. Then we have the son, who blasphemes or slanders God, or the name, in Leviticus chapter 24, as well as the stubborn, rebellious son in Deuteronomy chapter 21. These two are flagrant violations of what God has commanded. Often, when first-time violations were committed in the midst of this fledgling nation, a harsh punishment came with it. Consider the high priest Nadab and Abihu, like father, like sons, imitated Aaron's idolatry in the golden calf incident that happened in Exodus chapter 32. Nadab and Abihu offered strange fire, the pagan ritual of Western Semitic cults that was associated with one's appointment to the priesthood, and they were struck dead in Leviticus chapter 10. And Israelite men, deliberately lured into adultery and idolatry by Midianite women, were struck down because of their disregard for God's covenant in Numbers chapter 25. During David's monarchy, Uzzah, in 2 Samuel chapter 6, tried to steady the tottering Ark of the Covenant as it was being transported. How was Uzzah thanked for his efforts? God struck him dead. Even David was angered at God for killing Uzzah. Just think of Ananias and Sapphira in the New Testament in Acts chapter 5, who were struck dead for lying about just how generous they were. The message wasn't lost on the early church, because it says in Acts chapter 5, verse 11, that great fear came over the whole church and all who heard these things, the things that happened to Ananias and Sapphira. Especially in exemplary or first-time cases, God seems especially heavy-handed. He wants to show that he isn't to be trifled with. He wants to give people something that will stick in their minds at just how holy he is. He takes sin seriously, and he's often setting a precedent with first-time offenses. For the people of God, these punishments were to be sobering reminders of what God expected. So when Uzzah tried to steady the Ark of the Covenant, which David had placed on a new cart, God was making very clear that his instructions in the law of Moses had been ignored. The ark was to be carried on poles by the Levites, not transported by ox cart. And certain holy things weren't to be touched on pain of death. As God told Aaron and Moses after Nadab and Abihu were struck dead, in Leviticus chapter 10, by those who come near me, I will be treated as holy, and before all the people I will be honored. Now we're going to look at the glutton and drunkard of Deuteronomy chapter 21. What about this harsh text that we quoted earlier? We don't have any biblical record of this actually happening. But as with first-time offenses in Israel, the goal is to instruct that all Israel will hear of it and fear. What was the offense? We're not talking about a little practical joke or even about a teenager who won't clean up his room. No. He's an utter delinquent whose hardened, insubordinate behavior simply can't be corrected despite everyone's best efforts. He is morally debauched. He is past feeling. He has been repeatedly warned. He has been loved and been shown compassion and been shown patience, just like many of us in our sins and our lostness. When we have the sentence of death hanging over us because of our sins. But God, who's rich in mercy and doesn't want any to perish, but wants all to come to repentance, continues to be patient with us while we continue to make our sinful choices. God has appointed a day for each of us to die. We don't know when that day is. So we should call on the name of the Lord to be saved while we have today, because now's the expected time. Now's the day of salvation. We don't know when our day to die is, but this utter delinquent has ignored those warnings, the Old Testament equivalent of those warnings. He's a repeat offender. When the parents did chastise him, he didn't listen. He's a picture of insubordination. He's a glutton and a drunkard. This serious problem would have had a profoundly destructive effect on the family and the wider community. Jesus was called a glutton and drunkard, a very serious offense in Israel. This son, probably a firstborn, would inevitably squander his inheritance when his father died. He would likely bring to ruin his present and future family. He was like a compulsive gambler who bets away his home and life savings right out from under his family's feet. Notice, though, that the parents don't take matters into their own hands. The parents confer with the civil authorities who are responsible for keeping an orderly, functioning society. The parents aren't in the picture any longer. They're not taking charge of punishment. Rather, the community carries out this exercise of social responsibility, and when it takes this drastic action, it's a tragic last resort to deal with this trouble. In other words, this text that's quoted by the new atheists as this evil, vengeful, moral monster God, this isn't a first resort by any means. This is not a first resort. It's a tragic last resort. Now we're going to look at mediums, sorcerers, and false prophets. Mediums or diviners, and sorcerers or soothsayers were prohibited from living in Israel on pain of death. Those predicting the future through omens or signs, telling fortunes, and attempting to contact spiritual or demonic beings were outlawed. Likewise, false prophets who sought to lead Israel into idolatry were to be capitally punished. Deuteronomy chapter 13. The cult of the dead was common in the ancient Near East, including Canaan. Ancient Near Eastern peoples attempted to consult or connect with the dead so that they could step in and help the living. The ancient Near Eastern religions advocated mourning rituals like cutting one's body for the dead and putting tattoo marks on the body. The act of men trimming their hair on the sides of their head or the edges of their beard was a Canaanite practice of offering one's hair to departed spirits to appease them. None of that was to take place in Israel. God's people were to be different from the nations around them. They were to focus on life and the God of life, not the dead or false deities. No one was to consult the dead on behalf of the living. Israel's priests couldn't even attend funerals unless they were relatives of the deceased. They were to be holy to their God. So mediums and fortune tellers and the like, those in the dying business, were to be capitally punished. In a democratic society like ours in the United States of America, all that sounds intolerant. We're to respect the freedom of religion of others, aren't we? Yet Israel had bound herself to Yahweh, who had made a covenant with Israel, like a husband to a wife. The people of Israel themselves had vowed that they were God's and they would keep his covenant. They had willingly submitted to God's theocratic rule. So any intrusion into this relationship between Israel and God, whether in the form of foreign deities, political alliances, or consulting with the dead, that replaced trust in God, was in violation of these covenantal vows. God was not violating his covenant with them. They were violating their covenant with God. Even so, it's misleading for Sam Harris to speak of stoning to death a son or a daughter coming from a yoga class. The point of Deuteronomy chapter 13, verses 6 to 16 is that of a false teacher who tries to entice the community by commanding worship of other deities. When the false teacher says, let us go and serve other gods. Of course, those not wanting to embrace Israel's God or to obey Israel's God's requirements were free to leave Israel and live in another nation. This was the obvious preferable alternative. It was spiritually healthier for Israel and safer for theocratic opposers. Any remaining in the land were to respect the covenant and the laws that went with it. Differing strokes for different folks. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 1 through 3. If there's a dispute between men, and they come to court, and that the judges may judge them, and they justify the righteous and condemn the wicked, then it shall be, if the wicked man deserves to be beaten, then the judge will cause him to lie down and be beaten in his presence according to his guilt, with a certain number of blows. 40 blows you may give him, and no more, lest he should exceed this and beat him with many blows above these, and your brother be humiliated in your sight. End quote. Remember when the American 18-year-old Michael Fay was jailed in Singapore back in 1994? He had gone on a rampage of theft and destruction, spray painting cars at an auto dealership. Fay found out that you don't mess around like that in Singapore. After Fay and his parents pleaded with the authorities, Fay received 4 instead of 6 stinging lashes with a long cane. Now, the Singaporean strokes were less numerous but more severe than Semitic strokes. In Israel, rods were likely used. But still, doesn't the punishment of 40 strokes seem extremely harsh and overdone? Again, let's look more closely at this text to gain a greater appreciation for what's happening here. First, a proper trial had to take place. No one was to exact punishment personally, taking matters into his own hands. The process was to be supervised by the judge, who would ensure that the punishment was properly carried out. The punishment wasn't left up to the cruel whims of the punisher. This was a maximum penalty, and offenders were typically punished with fewer strokes than 40. Yet the maximum number of lashes was fixed and wasn't to be exceeded. The judge rendering the verdict and the punisher were to remember that the guilty party was a brother. The criminal was to be protected from the overreaction of a mob or individual. He wasn't to be humiliated so that your brother is not degraded in your eyes. A beating with rods does sound harsh to modern ears, yet the metaphor or image of the rod can have a gentler connotation of guiding, say, sheep, as in Psalm 23, or disciplining a child, as we see in the book of Proverbs. Again, the law prescribed a maximum punishment of strokes, and a judge could determine the lesser punishment. Furthermore, Israel's punishments were tame compared to the more brutal law codes and ruthlessness of other ancient Near Eastern cultures. For certain crimes, Hammurabi's code insisted that the tongue, breast, hand, or ear be cut off. One severe punishment involved the accused being dragged around a field by cattle. In ancient Egyptian law, punishments included cutting off the nose and the ear. The Code of Hammurabi insisted on death for a thief, whereas the Old Testament demanded only a double compensation for the loss. So there's an example of Hammurabi's code being more severe than the Bible. This contrast is one of many reminders that persons mattered more in Israel's legislation than in other cultures in the ancient Near East. When punishing criminals for perjury or libel, for example, Egyptian law permitted between 100 and 200 strokes. The 100-stroke beating was the mildest form of punishment. Regarding penalties for theft in the Old Testament, David Baker observes they are much more humane than in most ancient Near Eastern laws and never involve mutilation, beating, or death. So how does Deuteronomy chapter 25 look to you now? Israel's legislation allowed no more than 40 strokes for a criminal's punishment. That was the maximum penalty, one left up to the judge's assessment. By contrast, punishments in other places in the ancient Near East were extremely severe. So when you just take a look at things in face value, they look one way. But when you pull back a little bit and compare some of the other information going around from other cultures at the time, you see that the Old Testament way is not nearly as bad as the new atheist makes it seem. On top of all this, in Babylonian or Hittite law, for example, status or social rank determined the kind of sanctions for a particular crime. By contrast, biblical law held kings and priests and those of social rank to the same standards as the common person. Some may point to the following example as a moral upgrade. Initially, Hittite law stated that if a person plowed a sown field and sowed his own seed in its place, he was to be put to death. But later legislation, the criminal needed ritual purification and to bring sacrifice. While we can be grateful for this improvement, it still came nowhere near Israel's strong emphasis on compensation for property crimes, not the death penalty. People mattered more than property in Israel, a noted contrast with the rest of the ancient Near East. And for those who advocate abortion for personal convenience, it's obvious in those situations that property matters more than people, which is sad, which is why a pro-life position is the only position for a Christian. An eye for an eye? What is Scripture's emphasis on an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? Some consider such exacting punishments ruthless and barbaric. We should take another look, though. A much different picture emerges upon closer inspection. Such exacting punishments, called lex talionis, are mentioned in several places, like Exodus chapter 21, Leviticus chapter 24, and Deuteronomy chapter 19. What's interesting is that in none of these cases is an eye for an eye taken literally. Yes, a life for a life was taken in a straightforward way when it came to murder. Yet each example in these messages calls for a monetary compensation, not bodily mutilation. For example, following on the heels of the lex talionis passage in Exodus 21 comes, more in Exodus 21, and it illustrates the point we're making quite nicely. Exodus 21 verses 26 and 27. If a man hits a manservant or maidservant in the eye and destroys that eye, he must let the servant go free to compensate for the eye. And if he knocks out a tooth of a manservant or maidservant, he must let the servant go free to compensate for the tooth. We don't have a literal eye or tooth in view here, just compensation for bodily harm. Scholars such as Raymond Westbrook note that the lex talionis as a principle of compensation wasn't taken literally. The point of lex talionis is this: the punishment should fit the crime. Furthermore, these were the maximum penalties. Punishments were to be proportional and couldn't exceed that standard. And a punishment could be less severe if the judge deemed that the crime required a lesser penalty. Later, in the New Testament, Jesus himself didn't take such language literally either. This language had been misapplied by Jesus' contemporaries outside the law courts as a pretext for personal vengeance. At any rate, Jesus took this language no more literally than he did the language of plucking out eyes and cutting off hands if they were to lead one to sin. What's more, carrying out punishments that fit the crime protected the more vulnerable, the poor, the weak, and the alienated. The wealthy and powerful couldn't dictate the terms of punishment. In fact, the socially elite could receive these proportional punishments like everyone else. In addition, this lex talionis principle served as a useful guide to prevent blood feuds and disproportionate retaliation, like the mafia would do. When we compare Israel's punishments with other ancient Near Eastern legislation, the law of Moses presents a noteworthy moral development. As biblical scholar Brevard Childs points out, the lex talionis principle marks an important advance and was far from being a vestige from a primitive age. Some people might bring up the point that the Code of Hammurabi already had its own lex talionis, what we would call a bone for a bone as well as a tooth for a tooth. However, this applied when an aristocrat, a patrician, not a common person, a plebeian, was injured by a peer. Furthermore, we know that the Code of Hammurabi called for the cutting off of the actual hands, noses, breasts, and ears. Middle Assyrian laws from around 1100 BC, over 200 years after the law of Moses was given at Sinai, were outrageously disproportionate. They included beatings up to 100 blows as well as mutilations. So the expression an eye for an eye was a measure of justice, not something Israel took literally. Ox-goring legislation provides an interesting contrast between the Mosaic law and other ancient Near Eastern law codes. Codes like those of Hammurabi or Ashuna, for example, didn't reflect as high a regard for human life as did the Mosaic Code. In the other codes, if an ox was in the habit of goring, but the owner took no precautions to prevent the goring, so that it gored and killed a freeborn person, then a half mina or 2/3 of a mina in silver was paid to the victim's family, and the ox lived. By contrast, Exodus chapter 21, verses 28 to 36 presents a more severe maximum punishment because of the value of human life, which was reflected in Israel's laws. The requirement was to put a goring ox to death, and its meat couldn't be eaten. Furthermore, if an ox was in the habit of goring, and the owner did nothing to prevent this so that the ox killed a man or a woman, then the ox owner, not just the ox, could be put to death, and a maximum penalty. And we'll look at this in another angle shortly. Likewise, Hammurabi insisted that if a home builder was careless and his construction collapsed and killed a minor, then the builder's own child would be killed. By contrast, killing a child for the parent's offenses, or a parent for his child's offenses, wasn't permitted in Israel. Beyond all this, the ancient world lived by an unwritten code to take revenge for the killing of a family member. And it didn't matter whether or not the death was accidental. You killed my family member, I'll kill someone in your family. By contrast, Israel's law distinguished between accidental killing and intentional killing. Israel's law provided cities of refuge for those who'd accidentally killed another, as a way of preventing ongoing blood feuds. The noted historian Paul Johnson commented on Hammurabi's code, though much of the same could be said for other ancient Near Eastern law codes. Here's Paul Johnson. Quote, dreadful codes are notable for the ferocity of their physical punishments, in contrast to the restraint of the Mosaic Code and the enactments of Deuteronomy and Leviticus, end quote. One further matter. We've seen that the various ancient Near Eastern laws we've explored are far more harsh in comparison to Israel's laws. Even so, a range of scholars argue that punishments in the Mosaic Law and even in various ancient Near Eastern law codes are less fierce in actual practice. For example, Numbers chapter 35, verse 31 states, quote, you shall not take ransom or substitute payment for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death, end quote. This idea is reinforced in Exodus chapter 21, verses 29 to 30, where you have an ox goring a human to death as the result of an owner's negligence. Since this isn't premeditated murder, verse 30 allows for the possibility of monetary payment instead of taking the owner's life. Quote, if ransom is demanded of him, then he shall give for the redemption of his life whatever is demanded of him, end quote. Walter Kaiser points out that the general observation of Old Testament scholars. There were some 16 crimes that called for the death penalty in the Old Testament. Only in the case of premeditated murder did the text say the officials in Israel were forbidden to take a ransom or substitute. This has been widely interpreted to imply that all other 15 cases in all of the other 15 cases, the judge could commute the crimes deserving a capital punishment by designating a ransom or a substitute. What a beautiful picture of Christ there. He's the ransom, he's the substitute that takes the punishment that we deserve. In that case, the death penalty served to mark the seriousness of the crime. One could cite other scholars such as Raymond Westbrook, Jacob Finkelstein, Joseph Sprinkle, who readily concur with this assessment. So if we take the severe Old Testament punishments literally, we observe that the Mosaic Law is far less strict than other ancient Near Eastern law codes. If, on the other hand, we follow these scholars who take the Old Testament capital punishment laws as allowing for ransom payment instead, with the exception of premeditated murder, then this opens up a dramatically new perspective on these apparently severe punishments. What about infant sacrifices in Israel? Not a few critics will point out that the Old Testament assumes that infant sacrifice was acceptable in Israelite society and demanded as an act of worship by the God of Israel. Some will showcase Abraham and Isaac, though hardly an infant is one such example. Isaac was hardly an infant at that time. Such criticisms are off the mark, however. For one thing, the Mosaic Law clearly condemns child sacrifice as morally abhorrent in passages in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. As Susan Neidich points out in War in the Hebrew Bible, the dominant voice in the Old Testament condemns child sacrifice since it opposes God's purposes and undermines Israelite society. Let's look at a couple passages that allegedly suggest that human sacrifice was acceptable. First, we'll look at Mesha, the king of Moab, in 2 Kings chapter 3. In verse 27 of 2 Kings chapter 3, it says, Then he took his eldest son, who would have reigned in his place, and offered him as a burnt offering upon the wall, and there was a great indignation against Israel. So they departed from him and returned to their own land." End quote. Here, Mesha, Moab's king, sacrifices his firstborn son on the wall of Kir Hareseth in Moab. After this, the Israelite army withdrew because of wrath. Some think this is God's wrath, and that God is showing his approval of Mesha's sacrifice of his son by responding in wrath against Israel. This view, however, has its problems. This notion is at odds with clear condemnation of child sacrifice earlier in the Pentateuch, as well as repudiation of child sacrifice within the books of Kings, 2 Kings itself. The word fury or wrath, which is the Hebrew word ketzef, isn't divine wrath. Elsewhere in 2 Kings, a cognate word coming from the same root as ketzef clearly refers to human fury. Typically, commentators suggest several plausible interpretations. This was Moab's fury against Israel because their king Mesha, forced by desperation, sacrificed his son. Mesha's goal was to prompt Moab's renewed determination to fight. The another plausible commentator's interpretation, is that the Israelites were filled with horror or superstitious dread when they saw this human sacrifice, causing them to abandon the entire venture. Another commentator interpretation is that even though Mesha had failed in his attempt to break through the siege, perhaps to head north for reinforcements, he was still able to capture the king of Edom's firstborn son, whom he sacrificed on the wall, which demoralized Edom's army. The wrath of Edom's army ended the war because they withdrew from the military coalition of Israel, Judah, and Edom. Next, we're going to look at Jephthah's daughter from Judges chapter 11. Israel's judge Jephthah had made a rash vow. He said that whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the sons of Ammon who are opposing Israel, it shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering. That's Judges chapter 11, verse 31. So Jephthah probably thought it would be one of his servants who would come to attend to him. Yet Jephthah was horrified to see that his own daughter came out to meet him with tambourines and with dancing. Some Old Testament scholars argue that Jephthah didn't literally sacrifice his daughter. Most, however, are confident that the text does assert that Jephthah sacrificed his daughter. So let's take for granted the worst-case scenario, that Jephthah did sacrifice his daughter. Then comes the inevitable questions. Like, wouldn't Jephthah have clearly known that child sacrifice was immoral and that God judged the Canaanites for such sacrifices? Why then did Jephthah go along with the sacrifice of his daughter? Was it because God really did approve of child sacrifice after all? We'd already affirmed that "is" doesn't mean "ought" in the New Testament. Just because something is described doesn't mean that it's prescribed as a standard to follow. Certain behaviors are just bad examples that we shouldn't follow, such as what's in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 12. So let's make the necessary changes and apply our questioner's reasoning to another judge, the judge named Samson. As a judge in Israel, wouldn't Samson have clearly known that touching an unclean corpse was forbidden by Judges 14, verses 8 and 9, especially given his permanent Nazirite vow as recorded in Numbers chapter 6? Wasn't Samson fully aware that consorting with prostitutes was prohibited, like it says in Judges 16, or like Judges 16:1 describes? You get the idea. Keep in mind that we're talking about the era of Israel's judges. To borrow from Charles Dickens, this was in large part the worst of times, an age of foolishness, the season of darkness, and the winter of despair. So critics should be careful about assuming that Jephthah or Samson was in peak moral condition. Some might wonder, didn't the Spirit of the Lord come on Jephthah, like it says in Judges chapter 11, verse 29? Yes, but even though the Spirit of the Lord did come on Jephthah, we shouldn't take this as a wholesale divine endorsement of all that Jephthah did. No more than the Spirit's coming on Gideon in Judges chapter 6 was a seal of approval in Gideon's dabbling with idolatry, as recorded in Judges chapter 8, or Ehud's, for that matter, in Judges chapter 3. And if you're a believer reading this book, listening to this presentation, the Spirit of the Lord has come on you in that sense. And even though you are indwelt by the Spirit as a believer, your spirit still wages war against your flesh, and at times you give in to sin. So just because the Spirit of the Lord is involved in someone's life doesn't mean that that person's incapable of sinning. Yes, these judges of Israel would surely have known that idolatry was wrong. I want to make sure I enunciated that previous point clearly. Just because the Spirit of the Lord is at work in someone does not mean that a person is incapable of sinning. Someone who's indwelt by this Holy Spirit today is very much capable of sinning. Likewise, the Spirit of the Lord came on Samson to help Israel keep the Philistines at bay. Yet his plans to marry a Philistine woman, Delilah, cavorting with a prostitute and getting mixed up with Delilah, all reveal a judge was with exceedingly poor judgment. We can surely find a lesson here somewhere about how God works despite human sin and failure, right? The theology of Judges emphasizes a remarkable low point of Israelite moral. The theology of Judges emphasizes a remarkable low point of Israelite morality and religion, with two vivid narratives at the book's end to illustrate in chapters 17 and 21. Israel continually allowed itself to be Canaanized, and in light of the judge's repeated theme that every man did what was right in his own eyes, we shouldn't be surprised that Israel's leaders were also morally compromised. We don't have to look hard for negative role models and judges when Israel was in the moral basement. The Jephthah story needs no explicit statement of God's obvious disapproval. Some might press the point. Doesn't the Old Testament refer to offering the firstborn of God in Exodus, offering the firstborn to God in Exodus chapter 22? Following Ezekiel chapter 20, they claim that God literally gave harmful, not good statutes by which Israel could not live, commands involving sacrificing the firstborn in the fire. They assert that Yahweh just didn't like it when Israel sacrificed to other gods, but it was okay if they sacrificed to Yahweh. However, no such distinction is made. Infant sacrifice, whether to Yahweh or to Baal or to Molech, is still detestable. Yes, this was a common practice in Israel and Judah, like in 2 Kings 17 and 23, and Kings Ahaz, Manasseh, and others made their sons and daughters pass through the fire. But commonality here doesn't imply acceptability. Exodus refers to the redemption, not sacrifice, of the womb-opening firstborn child. God himself redeemed his firstborn Israel by bringing him up from Egypt. What then is Ezekiel talking about? The text clearly indicates that God gave the Sinai generation statutes, or chukot, or Sabbath commands, by which an Israelite may live. Israel rejected these laws given at Sinai. They refused to follow them, so God withdrew his hand. God responded to the second generation, the wilderness generation, as he does in Romans 1. He gave them over to statutes that were not good and laws they could not live by. Ezekiel not only distinguishes this word statutes, the masculine plural chukim, from statutes elsewhere in context, the feminine noun chukot, the text also involves quite a bit of irony. God sarcastically tells Israel to go and serve as idols, or to put it another way, go and sacrifice your children. This ironic statute to stubborn Israel to continue in idolatry and infant sacrifice is comparable to God's sarcasm in Amos chapter 4, verse 4. Go to Bethel and sin, and go to Gilgal and sin yet more. So there's not a literal command to go and commit sin, to go and sacrifice children. It's a, I'm fed up with you, I've been patient with you, but you're going to go and do what you want to do. Just do it. Not because I'm pleased by it, but you're going to do it anyway. So just do it. Have it your way. Not that I endorse it, not that I'm pleased with it, but you're bent on doing your own thing anyway. The same is true of the prophet Micaiah, who tells the disobedient Yahweh ignoring king of Israel, go up and succeed. The Lord will give it to the hand of the king. These are the sorts of sarcastic commands that aren't good by which Israel can't live. Now let's look at the value of unborn life. One of the big differences between the Old Testament laws and their ancient Near Eastern counterparts is the value of human life. Despite this, it's not unusual to hear that in ancient Israel, unborn life was not as valuable as life outside the womb. Indeed, certain pro-abortion advocates have sought theological justification for permitting abortion in the Exodus 21 verses 22 through 25 passage, where it says, if men fight and hurt a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows, he shall surely be punished according as the woman's husband imposes on him, and he shall pay as judges determine. But if any harm follows, and you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. The key issue is this. Should the Hebrew word yalad be translated give birth prematurely or have a miscarriage? If the mother miscarries, then the offender only has to pay a fine. The implication in this case is that the unborn child isn't as valuable and therefore isn't deserving of care normally given to a person outside the womb. Apparently, this Old Testament passage shows a lower regard for unborn life. Let's skip to another passage, Psalm 139, verses 13 to 16, which strongly supports the value of the unborn. For you formed me in my inward parts, you covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. My frame was not hidden from you, and I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Your eyes saw my substance, and being yet unformed. And in your book they all were written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them, end quote. Keep this text in mind as we go back to the Exodus 21 passage. Contrary to the above claims, Exodus 21 actually supports the value of unborn life. The word yalad means to go forth or give birth, describing a normal birth. I guess it's used in those other passages in parentheses there. It's always used of giving birth, not of a miscarriage. Yalad is always used of giving birth, not as of a miscarriage. If the biblical text intended to refer to a miscarriage, the typical word for miscarry or miscarriage is shekau or shekol. Those two words were available for miscarriage, but those words were not used. The word yalad was used. Miscarry isn't used here. Furthermore, yalad, which means to give birth, is always used of a child that has recognizable human form or is capable of surviving outside the womb. The Hebrew word nipel is the typical word used for an unborn child, and the word golem, which means fetus, is used only once in the Old Testament, in Psalm 139, verse 16, which we just noted. God knew the psalmist's unformed body or unformed substance. This brings us to another question. Who is injured, the baby or the mother? The text is silent. It could be either, since the feminine pronoun is missing. The gist of the passage seems to be this. If two men fight and hit a pregnant woman and the baby is born prematurely, but there is no serious injury to the child or mother, then the offender must be fined whatever the husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury to the baby or mother, you are to take life for life, eye for eye. These verses then actually imply the intrinsic value of the unborn child, that the life of the offender may be taken if the mother's or child's life is lost. The unborn child is given the same rights as an adult. So that's actually looking out for human life, contrary to the New Atheist claims. The New Atheists and other critics often resort to caricatures or straw men or misrepresentations of the Old Testament laws. They will twist and distort the truth to perpetuate their agenda, and their agenda is, if we remove God from the picture, then we don't have to appeal to absolute authority. We want to do our own thing, be our own boss. We want to be God, so we won't have anyone or anything be God over us. We want to be God. We don't want anyone telling us what to do. While Mosaic laws don't always reflect the ultimate or ideal, which the Old Testament itself acknowledges, these laws and the mindset they exhibit reveal dramatic moral improvement and greater moral sensitivity than their ancient Near Eastern counterparts. That is the end of Chapter 9 of Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan. Next time, we will look at Chapter 10, Is God Misogynistic? There's a lot... There's a lot of angry new atheists who like to play that trump card, that God is misogynistic, but we'll answer that objection next time, Lord willing. So thank you for tuning in. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And if it's available, please consider supporting my ministry by purchasing my published work, the volume on the first 30 chapters of the Book of Psalms, Pinnacles and Plateaus, Meditations with the Psalmist. And I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.